Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to realize later how wrong you were? A man who thought he knew everything until he found out who he was really talking to. It's a powerful lesson about humility, respect, and why we should never underestimate the quietest person in the room. The lobby of the Langston Grand Hotel was exactly what one would expect from a five-star luxury resort. Polished marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, velvet armchairs sat in elegant clusters around low tables, and the air was filled with the quiet murmur of polite conversation mixed with the delicate clinking of crystal glasses. Sunlight poured through towering glass windows, catching on the gold trim and ornate molding that adorned every corner of the expansive room, casting a warm glow over everything. A grand piano sat off to one side, though no one played at the moment, its presence adding to the room's effortless sophistication. Daniel Foster, lounging casually in one of the oversized leather chairs near the bar, looked as if he belonged to the place, or at least he thought he did. Sipping an expensive whiskey, he oozed the kind of confidence that came from years of closing deals and shaking hands in exclusive boardrooms. A tech investor with a rising name, Daniel was the kind of man who carried himself like his opinion was the only one that mattered. His perfectly tailored suit, glimmering watch, and polished shoes all screamed money and ego, though he believed it was simply success. His sharp eyes scanned the room, sizing up everyone as if evaluating a business opportunity, until they settled on a woman sitting alone across the lounge. Blonde hair pulled back, dressed in understated elegance, Pam Bondi sat quietly, focused on her tablet, the very image of poise. But Daniel didn't see that. To him, she was just one of those women, the type who lurked in luxury hotels waiting for wealthy men to notice them. He smirked to himself, already preparing clever comments in his head, completely unaware of who she really was. To Daniel, this was just another afternoon of entertainment, and she was about to be the target of it. Daniel took another slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes lazily drifting back toward the woman across the lounge. She sat with a straight posture, scrolling through her tablet as if she didn't have a care in the world. To him, that kind of confidence in a woman like her was laughable. He leaned over slightly to the bartender polishing glasses behind the counter, lowering his voice just enough to pretend he was making casual conversation, but loud enough to ensure anyone nearby, including her, could hear. "You see her over there?" he asked, gesturing with a nod of his head. The bartender glanced briefly, giving no real reaction. Daniel smirked, continuing without invitation. "Let me guess, waiting for some rich guy to show up and pick up her tab." He chuckled to himself, glancing around to see if anyone else would share in his joke. The businessman seated a few stools away gave a quick glance, but turned back to his drink, clearly uninterested. But Daniel wasn't one to pick up on social cues. He thrived on attention, and if he wasn't getting it, he'd just keep trying harder. "Bet she's here to meet husband number 3, Daniel went on, swirling the ice in his glass. "You know the type, polished, perfect, probably posts inspirational quotes on Instagram about independent women while someone else pays her bills." His smirk widened, clearly amused with himself. Meanwhile, Pam didn't even look up from her tablet, her focus unbroken. Her indifference only seemed to fuel Daniel more, as though her refusal to acknowledge his presence was a personal insult. He shifted in his seat, raising his glass as if to toast her across the room. "Cheers to her next divorce settlement," he muttered, loud enough for the bartender, and others within earshot, to hear. Still, Pam remained perfectly composed, her stillness a sharp contrast to Daniel's performative arrogance. But some guests had begun to notice. A woman in a tailored suit exchanged a knowing glance with her companion, and a man near the window looked over his newspaper briefly. Daniel, oblivious, thought he was winning the room. What he didn't realize was that the room was watching him, not her, and his assumptions were about to be shattered in a way he didn't expect. Daniel leaned back in his chair, draping one arm casually over the side as though he owned the entire lounge. But beneath his cocky exterior, a subtle irritation was growing. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by a woman he had decided wasn't worth half the attention she was getting from him. Pam's calm indifference made his arrogance feel misplaced, and the more she ignored him, the more determined he became to provoke a reaction. He waved the bartender over again with a flick of his hand like a king summoning a servant. "Another for me," he said smoothly, then added with a smirk, "and whatever she's having too, on me." His voice was louder now, making sure several guests nearby could hear. The bartender paused, giving a polite but unreadable nod. "Sir, I believe the lady is fine," he replied, his tone professional but distant. Daniel's smirk faded just slightly, the rejection stinging more than he expected. "Of course she is," he muttered under his breath, watching Pam, who didn't even glance up. He turned toward the businessman sitting a few chairs down, seeking an ally. "You ever notice that?" he said, leaning in slightly as though sharing some inside joke. "Some people sit in places like this acting like they're better than everyone else, like they own the place." The businessman gave a tight smile but said nothing, returning to his laptop. Daniel barely noticed the cold shoulder. He was too busy trying to prove a point only he thought was clever. "She probably thinks she's too good to even say hello," Daniel went on, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Bet she's just waiting for some old guy to come pick her up. Probably drove here in a car she can't afford, hoping to impress somebody." Still, Pam never looked up, her posture calm and composed, as though Daniel's presence didn't even register. Her silence was louder than any insult she could have thrown back, and that made him seethe. Daniel picked up his whiskey and took a sharp sip, then set it down a little too firmly on the table. The sound echoed slightly, drawing glances from nearby guests. One woman whispered something to her friend, and a man reading the newspaper raised an eyebrow in quiet disapproval. Daniel, caught in his own ego, mistook their glances for agreement. He grinned and shrugged, playing the part of the man who didn't care, but deep down he did care, and Pam's refusal to give him the satisfaction of a response gnawed at him. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice but keeping it loud enough for the table next to him to hear. "Mark my words," he sneered. "She'll be on her phone later, complaining about some rude man. That's how it always goes." What Daniel didn't know, what he was about to learn the hard way, was that Pam Bondi wasn't the type of woman to play the games he was used to winning, and soon he'd realize just how badly he had miscalculated. The lounge had fallen into a strange, charged kind of silence, the kind that lingers when someone's words hang too long in the air. Daniel, still nursing his third whiskey, sat back with an arrogant smirk, glancing toward Pam as though waiting for her to finally break and give him what he wanted, a reaction. But Pam remained unfazed, scrolling through her tablet, her posture as composed as if she were sitting in a private study rather than under the verbal fire of an obnoxious stranger. It wasn't until Daniel leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows on his knees, that he made his final attempt to get under her skin. "You know," he said in a voice just loud enough to carry to her table, "the least you could do is say thank you when someone offers to buy you a drink. But I guess some people are just too wrapped up in themselves for that." There was a flicker of movement, so small and subtle it was easy to miss, as Pam gently set her tablet down on the table in front of her. Slowly she looked up, her eyes calm but sharp, like someone who had been patiently waiting for the right moment. For the first time, she turned to face Daniel directly, and the change in the air was immediate. Daniel straightened a bit, smirking in anticipation, but as Pam's gaze locked on his grin faltered slightly, though he tried to mask it. "I'm curious," Pam said softly, her voice smooth and measured, not angry, not defensive, but cutting in its precision. "Do you always go out of your way to insult strangers, or is today just special?" The words landed like a punch in the otherwise hushed lounge. A few heads turned. People who had been pretending not to listen now fully tuned in. Daniel blinked, thrown for a split second. He recovered quickly, adjusting his jacket. "Just making conversation," he said, trying to keep his voice light, but there was a noticeable tension in his tone. Pam tilted her head slightly, studying him in a way that made Daniel visibly uncomfortable. "Conversation," she echoed thoughtfully. "Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm sitting it looks more like someone trying very hard to impress people who aren't impressed." A soft murmur rippled through the room. Nothing loud, but a subtle acknowledgement that everyone had been following every word. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Pam wasn't finished. "See, here's the thing," she continued, leaning forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "You don't know me. You made a lot of assumptions based on absolutely nothing. And you've been sitting there, telling a story about who you think I am, as if that makes you clever. But all it makes you is loud." The bartender behind the counter paused in wiping a glass, watching closely now. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his smirk slipping. "Look, I didn't mean—" Pam held up a hand, not rudely, but with a quiet authority that immediately silenced him. "You don't need to explain yourself to me," she said evenly. "But maybe, just maybe, you should think twice before you decide you've figured out a person's worth based on what you see in 5 minutes." For a long, breathless moment, Daniel didn't say a word. He simply sat there, caught between wanting to defend himself and knowing that nothing he said would fix what he had just exposed about himself. Pam gave him one final look, not angry, not gloating, just calm and resolute, before picking up her tablet again. But this time the silence around her felt different. The room was on her side now. And Daniel, for the first time since she walked into that lounge, knew it. Daniel sat stiffly in his chair, the echo of Pam's words still hanging heavy in the air. The lounge, once filled with low conversations and soft clinks of glass, felt like it had gone completely still. He tried to shake off the discomfort, shifting in his seat and reaching for his drink, but this time, his usual swagger felt hollow. As he took a sip of whiskey that didn't quite settle the knot in his chest, the hotel's lounge manager, a sharply dressed man, approached Pam with a warm, professional smile. "Miss Bondi," he greeted her politely, "is there anything else I can get for you before your meeting? The conference room is ready whenever you are." Daniel's glass stopped halfway to his lips. "Miss Bondi." The name rang in his head, familiar and impossible to ignore. He turned slightly in his chair, brow furrowed, watching as Pam smiled graciously at the manager and shook her head. "No, thank you. I'll be along shortly," she replied, her tone composed as ever. Daniel's mind started racing, as if scrambling to place her face with the name. And then, like a punch to the gut, it clicked. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of Florida, the woman who had led some of the nation's most high-profile cases, who had stood on national stages and sparred with some of the most powerful figures in the country, the woman who had been on news channels, courtroom broadcasts, and political panels. He had been mocking her, Pam Bondi. His throat went dry as he slowly set his glass back on the table, fingers tightening around it as the realization washed over him. He glanced around the lounge, suddenly hyper-aware of the people who had overheard him, of the side glances he had mistaken for approval, but now knew were judgment. Pam, calm, quiet, and effortlessly composed, had never needed to say a word about who she was. She had let him embarrass himself, allowed him to dig his own grave, all while sitting there knowing that she was a woman far more powerful and influential than he could ever hope to be. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling a flush rise to his cheeks. How had he not recognized her? How had he missed the sharp eyes, the commanding presence? But now, it was too late to take any of it back. Across the room, Pam glanced up from her tablet briefly, her eyes meeting Daniel's for just a second. Not with anger, not even with smugness, but with a quiet knowing that made him feel smaller than he had ever felt before. The manager walked away and Pam resumed reading, as though Daniel no longer existed. And maybe, for her, he never had. Daniel sat frozen, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him like a tidal wave he never saw coming. The easy confidence that usually carried him through any room, any conversation, had completely evaporated, leaving behind an unfamiliar but undeniable feeling: shame. It was raw and heavy, gnawing at the edges of his pride. The realization that he had spent the last 30 minutes mocking a woman who had walked through more rooms of power than he could ever hope to enter, hit him like a punch straight to the gut. Pam Bondi. Now that her name was connected to the face sitting just feet away, her presence seemed glaringly obvious. Of course it was her. How could he not have seen it? He had watched her on television countless times, standing at podiums during high-profile cases, commanding entire rooms with her words. He had heard her on news channels, watched her debate seasoned politicians, and hold her own against the toughest opponents. And yet somehow he had reduced her to a punchline, treating her like another woman to tear down for sport. Daniel stared into his glass, his fingers trembling slightly, the ice clinking against the sides. Fragments of his own cruel words echoed relentlessly in his mind, each one now more humiliating than the last. What had once seemed clever or funny was now just a mirror reflecting back his own insecurities. Every jab, every smirk, none of them said anything about Pam. They only revealed his own weakness. And Pam? She had never once risen to the bait. She had let him destroy himself brick by brick, word by word, regal, calm, unbothered. She didn't have to lower herself to his level. She had let his own arrogance expose him for who he really was. Daniel glanced around the room, noticing now how other guests were looking at him. Not with admiration as he had assumed, but with quiet judgment, thinly veiled glances that told him exactly what they thought. For the first time in years, Daniel felt powerless, and it terrified him. Pam had shown him that real strength doesn't have to raise its voice, doesn't need to fight for attention. Real power is knowing you don't have to say a word to win. As he exhaled shakily, Daniel realized he had been given a lesson, one he wouldn't forget anytime soon, and one he desperately needed to learn. Daniel sat silently, his earlier bravado drained away, staring into the half-empty glass on the table as if it might offer answers to the mess he had created. The room around him had slowly returned to its gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of glassware. But for Daniel, everything still felt heavy and sharp, like the moment hadn't passed at all. The weight of Pam's calm, piercing gaze from earlier still lingered over him like a shadow he couldn't shake, a silent judgment that cut deeper than any words could have. Across the room, Pam gathered her things, sliding her tablet carefully into her leather bag with a graceful ease that only emphasized her poise. She didn't rush. She didn't falter. She moved as though nothing, not even his cruel remarks, could touch her. And somehow, that made Daniel feel even smaller. He watched her closely now, but not the way he had before. Now there was a mix of regret, shame, and something he hadn't expected. Respect. For a fleeting moment, Daniel thought about standing up, crossing the room and offering an apology, something, anything, to make up for what he had said. But as he watched Pam rise, shoulders squared, walking with quiet confidence toward the elevator, he knew she didn't need or want his apology. She had already decided he wasn't worth another moment of her time. And somehow, that was the harshest lesson of all. As Pam passed by, she didn't glance at him. Didn't need to. But her presence stayed with him. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, mind racing. Maybe, for once, it was time to stop talking and start thinking. The story of Daniel Foster and Pam Bondi teaches a powerful lesson about judgment, arrogance, and true strength. Daniel, a man used to wielding power through money and ego, quickly judged Pam based on her appearance, assuming she was insignificant. But what he failed to realize was that real power doesn't need to announce itself. It stands quietly, confident and unmoved. Pam never argued, never stooped to his level, and in doing so she showed that dignity and self-respect are stronger than any insult. Through his encounter with Pam, Daniel was forced to confront his own insecurities and the way he treated people he thought were beneath him. The glances of others, the weight of Pam's silence, and finally learning her identity all made him realize that arrogance doesn't command respect. Character does. The story reminds us that you never truly know who someone is or what they've accomplished, and making assumptions based on surface judgments is a reflection of our own flaws, not theirs. In the end, Daniel learned that humility and respect should guide how we treat others, because the quietest person in the room might be the one with the most power.